You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Thursday evening, folks. Welcome to my show. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program, as the header said at the very beginning. And you're also watching this over on my YouTube channel in simulcast in video, joining the live chat room over there. Now, you can find the audio version of the show at odysy1.com, odyssey1.com, and you can come on over to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And join the chat room over there. I think you'll have a good time. It's where all the Intrep heads hang out and watch the show and talk amongst each other. So looking forward to having you there. Thanks for being here to listen either way. And we've been in this little series we've started doing on Native America, Native American, the subjugation of the Native Americans by the United States government, who imposed what they called manifest destiny. They were manifest their destiny by God to own the entire continent. And to do this, they had to drive people from their homes. And this was not because there was a war or they were threatened by these people. It's because they wanted the land on which the Native Americans lived and dwelt. And so they pushed them all into concentration camps, which they called reservations. And they made treaties with them, which they broke time and time and time again. I don't think there has been a single treaty that was not broken and rewritten. And so we're looking at some of the events that led up to all of that. This is all in the 1800s, the mid-1800s right now. We're during the Civil War period, looking at a couple of events so far. We looked at the Navajo being pushed onto the Bosque Redondo. And now we're looking at Little Crow's War, which is kind of near and dearer to my heart as it took place here where I live. It was down in southern Minnesota where this took place. Fort Snelling played a major role after this war. This was the Dakota War that took place in 1862. And we're recounting the events of Little Crow and the Minnewankaton Sioux and others who joined in to fight the whites at the fort. And it was all over breaking of treaties by the U.S. government. It was all by the starving peoples that had already been pushed onto reservations that were waiting for their treaty allotments because they were starving. They didn't have food. They weren't allowed to hunt. And they would break the treaty by going out and hunting. And so they're waiting for this to happen. The Indian agents appointed by the U.S. government to dole out the goods and their money weren't coming through. The U.S. government wasn't coming through because it was in the middle of a civil war over in the east. And so they were short on money. And so the Indians eventually raided the warehouses and said, we've got to eat. You're one guy, the Indian agent. I'm sorry if this is on your back financially. We have 400 people plus that need to eat. And they raided the warehouses, the storehouses, and they emptied them out. And this caused the Indian agent to call in the military, of course, who pursued the, and as you can see, war broke out. Now, the Indians decided that they were going to attack the fort, and that's where we kind of left off last night. And it's almost like watching a movie unfold here, if you can get the picture in your head. And so they had already made one attack on the fort. They weren't sure what was happening. They weren't sure if they were really killing anybody, if they were really accomplishing anything yet. and they withdrew, and there were about 400 Indians that were in the attack. The women and children stayed back at the camp, and that evening in the village, both Little Crow and Big Eagle were in low spirits because they hadn't been able to take the soldier's house. Big Eagle opposed another attack, and the Santee didn't have enough warriors to storm the soldiers' big guns, and they would lose too many men if they made another attack. So Little Crow said that he'd rather decide later what to do. Meanwhile, everyone should go to work making as many bullets as possible, and there was plenty of gunpowder left from the agency's storehouse that they'd raided. And later in the evening, the situation changed. 400 Wahpeton and Sisseton warriors came in from the upper agency, and they offered to join the Minnewakanton in their war against the white men. And Little Crow, he was absolutely elated at this. This is going to help us. The Santee Sioux were united again, 800 strong now, and surely enough warriors to take Fort Ridgely. And he called a war council and issued strict orders for the next day's fighting, and this time they must not fail at fulfilling his orders. Remember, he told them the day before, 3 shots. When I give the 3 shots, well, they were all anxious and worked on their own, and somebody else did the 3 shots. And so they had to just launch into things. Now, early on August 22nd, we started, Lightning Blanket said, but the grass was wet with dew, more than on the first day of the attack. And by the way, if you've ever been here in Minnesota in August, we're at the beginning of July right now. It's really humid and hot. And when the sun comes up, the dew just hangs like somebody had just flooded the ground. And so the dew was really wet on the grass, and more than the day of the first attack, and so the sun was quite high before we traveled very far. This is Lightning Blanket speaking. And it was just before the middle of the day when we reached the fort. We didn't stop to eat this time, but we carried something to eat. Each man carried something to eat in his legging sash and ate it in the middle of the day while fighting. Big Eagle said the second fight at Fort Ridgely was a grand affair. We went down determined to take the fort, for we knew it was of greatest importance to us to have the fort. If we could just take it, we would soon have the whole Minnesota Valley. And this time, instead of approaching the fort boldly, the Santee warriors fastened prairie grass and flowers to their headbands as a means of concealment, and then crept up the gullies and crawled through the brush until they were close enough to fire upon the defenders. And a shower of blazing arrows set roofs afire. Then the Santee rushed the stables. In this fight, said Wakung De Mane, I came up on the south side to the stables and tried to get a horse. As I was leading it out, a shell burst near the stable, near me, and the horse sprang over me and got away, knocking me down. When I got up, I saw a mule running, and I was so mad, I shot the mule. That's his remembrances of this battle. And for a few minutes, there was a hand-to-hand fighting around the stables, but again, the Santee had to give way before the fierce blasts of the soldiers' artillery. And Little Crow, he was wounded, but not seriously, from the loss of blood, though he was very weakened. And when he withdrew from the field to regain his strength, Mankato led another assault. Double charges of canister shot cut down the rushing warriors, and the attack failed. Canister shot. That's where they have these little canisters full of all different kinds of shot. It was a lot like grape shot. When you think of that during the Revolutionary War, the British used that on the attack at Fort Quebec. It was in the winter of 1776. I think it was 1776 or 1775. It was prior to the Declaration of Independence, and it was actually Benedict Arnold was part of that attack. And General Montgomery was mowed down. But the British used grape shot, which was a lot like this canister shot. It's where they shoved all kinds of musket balls and bits of iron and metal and everything down into the cannon, and blew it out, and you had this spray of hot shrapnel that would cut everybody down. And so that's what they did with the double charges of canister shot. And it cut down all these rushing warriors as they were attacking. So the attack failed. But for the cannon, I think we would have taken the fort, Big Eagle said. The soldiers fought us so bravely, we thought there were more of them than there were. About 150 soldiers and 25 armed civilians defended Fort Ridgely on August 22nd against these 800 Sioux. Now, Big Eagle lost most of the men in the fighting that day. Late in the afternoon, the Santee leaders, they called off the attack. The sun was setting low, Lightning Blanket said, and after we saw the men on the south and west driven back by the big guns, we could see Little Crow and his men going to the northwest. He decided to join them and see what to do. After joining them, we supposed we were going back to Little Crow's village for more warriors. Little Crow told us there were no more warriors, and a discussion followed. Some wanted to renew the attack on the fort the next morning and then go to New Ulm. Others wanted to attack New Ulm early in the next morning and then come back and take the fort. And we were afraid the soldiers would get to New Ulm first. And so the soldiers that Lightning Blanket referred to were 1,400 men of the 6th Minnesota Regiment who were approaching the fort from St. Paul. Now, by car today, St. Paul down to where Fort Ridgely was, Minnesota, an hour's drive by car, maybe 2. And so I'm trying to think of exactly where that fort stood. But if you're talking down in the Minnesota River Valley, you don't have to go very far out of Minneapolis and St. Paul to get there. And as a matter of fact, the major highways going to some of the far south suburbs in the Minnesota River Valley, Apple Valley, places like that in Minnesota, people commute to the city every day. So St. Paul, being a little further to the east, so they're sending down 1,400 men of the 6th Minnesota Regiment approaching from St. Paul, probably Fort Snelling. And they were led by a soldier chief quite well known to the Santee. He was the long trader, Colonel Henry H. Sibley. And the $475,000 promised the Santee in their first treaty, Long Trader had claimed $145,000 for his American Fur Company as money due for overpayment to the Santee. Now, this is Sibley. There's a county named after him, Sibley County. He became a governor of the state of Minnesota. Sibley, now, if you stand at Fort Snelling and you look across the river, there's a little cluster of old stone houses and a stone church. That's a historic site now. It's a museum site, the Sibley House. We've been there a few times. You can go over and go through the houses, and you can see the fort across the river. And so this is that Sibley. So Colonel Sibley came down. And he claimed, well, what is that? 475 minus 145 gives you the idea, thousands of dollars that he took for himself, saying, well, this is my compensation for overpayments to the Santee. And so the Santee believed the fur company had underpaid them. But their agent, Alexander Ramsey is another big name, Ramsey County is St. Paul, Minnesota. Alexander Ramsey had accepted Sibley's claim, as well as the claims of others, and you wonder how much Ramsey was paid off in this. And the Santees received practically nothing for their land as a result of all of this, because all these claims made. So Ramsey was now the governor of Minnesota, and he had appointed the long trader, Sibley, to be the Eagle Chief of the Minnesota Regiment. And at the mid-morning of August 23rd, the Santee attacked New Ulm. That's a city down in southwestern Minnesota, not far from a few hours away. But that's the region you're in now, a couple of hours from the Twin Cities. New Ulm, of course, is where you always hear, if you ever watched as a kid, Little House on the Prairie or read Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, New Ulm was the town they always went to. They were closest to New Ulm, and it was a trip from where they lived, but New Ulm was where where they went to town. And so they streamed out of the woods in bright sunlight. They formed an arc across the prairie, and they swept toward the town. And the citizens of New Ulm were ready for them. After the abortive attack by the Young Braves on August 19th, 4 days earlier, the townspeople had built barricades. They brought in more weapons and secured the help of the militia from towns down the valley. When the Santee came within 1.5 miles of the forward line of the white defenders, the mass of warriors began spreading like a fan, and at the same time they increased their speed and began yelling war cries to frighten the white men. And Mankato was the war leader on this day. Now, Mankato, of course, is a big town nearby all of that, down in southern Minnesota, named after Mankato, the war chief. And Mankato was the war leader on this day. Little Crow lay wounded in his village, and his plan of attack was to envelop the town. And the firing on both sides was sharp and rapid, but the onrush of Indians was slowed by the citizens, who used loopholed buildings for defense positions. Early in the afternoon, the Santee set fire to several structures in New Ulm, on the windward side of New Ulm, in an expectation of advancing under a smokescreen. And 60 warriors, mounted and on foot, charged a barricade, but were driven back by heavy volleys. It was a long and bitter battle, and it was fought in the streets, dwellings, outhouses, store buildings, and when darkness fell, the Santee departed without a victory. But they left behind them the smoldering ruins of 190 buildings and more than 100 casualties among the stubborn defenders of New Ulm. The figure just popped in my head. Here you have Native Americans attacking. The Indians attacked the town. They left 190 buildings, smoldering ruins. And I was just thinking of the riots in Minneapolis over the last month. The initial riots in Minneapolis, in the uptown area, left 170 smoldering buildings, looted buildings. So, not much different. So 3 days later, the advance column of Long Trader Sibley's regiment reached Fort Ridgely, and the Santee began withdrawing up the Minnesota Valley. They had with them more than 200 prisoners, mostly white women and children, and a considerable number of half-breeds known to be sympathetic toward the whites. Now, after establishing this temporary village about 40 miles from the upper agency, Little Crow began negotiating with other Sioux leaders in the area, hoping to gain their support to come and help. And he had little success. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. One reason for their lack of enthusiasm was Little Crow's failure to drive the soldiers from Fort Ridgely. Another reason was the indiscriminate killing of white settlers on the north side of the Minnesota River, a bloody slaughter carried out by marauding bands and undisciplined young men while Little Crow was besieging Fort Ridgely. So several hundred settlers had been trapped in their cabins without warning. Many had been brutally slain. Others had fled to safety, some to the villages of the Sioux bands that Little Crow hoped would join his cause. Now remember, keep in mind in the back of your head, yesterday we talked about this Little Crow. A few days earlier had told his warriors, "I won't fight. We shouldn't do this. This will bring death to us all." Keep that in mind. And what happened was you had a bunch of angry Indians, angered by the lack of food, angered by the broken treaties, angered by the loss of their land. Not saying this is justifiable to kill people, but these are the things that cause war. They were starving. They had no supplies. The money promised them was not there. The money to buy their land and for them to go onto the reservation. The treaties were broken. And the Indian agent wouldn't give them supplies. And they had to take them, and this started this whole thing rolling. They had to go out stealing food just to eat. And this was all because they had been pushed off of their lands. The whites did not want to live peaceably with them. on their own, but they wanted their land, and they took it from them. And this was the result. So you had a bunch of angry young warriors who, while Little Crow was attacking the fort of the soldiers representing the U.S. government, they were attacking the citizens, the common folk, the pioneer, and they killed several hundred settlers had been trapped, and they killed them. And although Little Crow was contemptuous of those who made war on defenseless settlers, he knew that his decision to begin the war had unleashed the raiders. But it was too late to turn back. The war against the soldiers would go on as long as he had warriors to fight them. And on September 1st, now we're looking another week down the road, from their first attack on the fort, he decided to make a scout downriver to test the strength of Long Trader Sibley's army. The Santee divided into two forces, Little Crow leading 110 warriors along the north side of the Minnesota, while Big Eagle and Mankato scouted the south bank with a larger force. Little Crow's plan was to avoid a frontal meeting with the soldiers, and instead slip around to the rear of Sibley's lines and try to capture the Army's supply train. To do this, he made a wide swing to the north, bringing his warriors close to several settlements, which had withstood attacks from marauders during the previous 2 weeks. The temptation to raid some of the smaller settlements brought on dissension among Little Crow's followers. They wanted to attack the settlements, and Little Crow said, "No, follow my plan." And on the second day of the reconnaissance, one of the sub-chiefs called a war council and proposed that they attack the settlements for plunder. Little Crow was opposed to this decision. Their enemies were the soldiers, he insisted. They must fight the soldiers, not the common folk. And their enemies were the soldiers. And at the end of the council, 75 warriors joined the sub-chief for plundering and attacking the civilians. And only 35 loyal followers remained with Little Crow. And on the following morning, Little Crow's small party unexpectedly met a company of 75 soldiers. During the running battle which followed, the sound of musketry brought the defecting Santee of the previous day rushing back to Little Crow's rescue. In bloody close-in fighting, the soldiers used their bayonets, but the Santee killed 6 and wounded 15 of their enemy before the latter escaped in a hasty retreat to Hutchinson, Minnesota. And for the next 2 days, the Santee reconnoitered around Hutchinson and Forest City, but the soldiers remained within the stockades. On September 5th, runners brought news of the battle a few miles to the southwest. Big Eagle and Mankato had trapped the Long Trader's soldiers at Birch Coulee. And during the night before the battle at Birch Coulee, Big Eagle and Mankato had quietly surrounded the soldiers' camp so they couldn't escape. And just at dawn, the fight began, Big Eagle said. It continued all day long and until late the next morning. And both sides fought well. Owing to the white man's way of fighting, they lost many men. Owing to the Indians' way of fighting, they lost but a few. About the middle of the afternoon, our men became much dissatisfied at the slowness of the fight and the stubbornness of the whites, and the word was passed around the lines to get ready to charge the camp. The brave Mankato wanted to charge after the first hour. And just as we were about to charge, says Big Eagle, word came up that a large number of mounted soldiers were coming up from the east toward Fort Ridgely. This would have been the soldiers from St. Paul, the 1400. And this stopped the charge and created some excitement. Mankato at once took some men from the coulee and went out to meet them. And that's where we got to stop in this first segment. We'll be back after this break. Sit tight for the stirring continuation of this story. Stay tuned.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, we're back. Thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You can come over and watch the simulcast in video and join the live chat room at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we left you with a little bit of a cliffhanger, a slight cliffhanger, about this war that's now going on in Minnesota, Little Crow's War, which was later called the Dakota War by the whites. And so you've got now the, I want to recap just a touch here, because you've got Little Crow's small party met a company of 75 soldiers, and during the running battle, the sound of musketry brought all those who had defected to go attack all the settlements of civilians back to Little Crow's rescue. And in the close fighting, the soldiers used their bayonets. The Santee killed 6 and wounded 15. And then during the night, they kept fighting all the way through the middle of the morning with the soldiers, who were all billeted in the stockades, and Mankato wanted to charge. But just as we were about to charge, word came that a large number of mounted soldiers were coming up from the east from toward Fort Ridgely. And this stopped the charge and created some excitement. Mankato at once took some men from the coulee and went out to meet them. And that's where we left off after the first segment. And so Mankato flourished his men around so, and all the Indians and the coulee kept up a noise, and at last the whites began to fall back. And they retreated about 2 miles and began to dig breastworks. Mankato followed them and left about 30 men to watch them, and returned to the fight at the coulee with the rest. The Indians were laughing when they came back at the way they had deceived the white men. And they were all glad that the whites had not pushed forward and driven us away. And so the next morning, this is still the account, Big Eagle, the next morning General Sibley came with a very large force and drove us away from the field. We took our time getting away. Some of our men said they remained till Sibley got up, and that they fired at some of his men as they were shaking hands with some of the men of the camp. Those of us who were on the prairie went back to the westward and on down the valley. There was no pursuit by the soldiers. The whites fired their cannon at us as we were leaving the field, but they might as well have been beating a big drum for all the harm they did. They only made a noise. We went back across the river to our camps in the old village, and then up on top of the river to the Yellow Medicine and the mouth of the Chippewa, where Little Crow joined us. At last the word came that Sibley with his army was again on the move against us. He had left a letter for Little Crow in a split stick on the battlefield of Birch Coulee, and some of our men found the letter and brought it in. The message left by Long Trader Sibley was brief and non-committal. He rolled up a letter, put it in a split of a stick, and stuck it in the ground at the battlefield, and they found it. And the letter said, "If Little Crow has any proposition to make, let him send a half-breed to me, and he shall be protected in and out of camp." And this is signed H.H. Sibley, Colonel Commander, so on. Now, Little Crow, of course, didn't trust this man, who was sharp enough to get away with so much of the Santee's trust money, or treaty money, but he decided to send a reply. He thought that perhaps the long trader who'd been up at the White Rock, St. Paul, did not know why the Santee had gone to war. So Little Crow also wanted Governor Ramsey to know the reasons for why they went to war. He thinks these guys have been sent out to relieve and to join in the fight, but they might not know why we're doing this. And so he wanted them to know. And so many of the neutrals among the Santee were frightened at what Ramsey told the white Minnesotans. Quote, "The Sioux Indians must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state." End quote. So Little Crow's message of September 7th to General Sibley said this: "For what reason we've commenced this war, I will tell you. It is on account of Major Galbraith. We made a treaty with the government and beg for what we do get, and can't get that till our children are dying with hunger. It's the traders who commenced it. Mr. A.J. Myrick told the Indians that they could eat grass or dirt. Then Mr. Forbes actually said they could eat grass or shit. So, he was being polite in his letter. Then Mr. Forbes told the Lower Sioux that they were not men. Then Roberts was working with his friend to defraud us out of our monies." Not me. Not my ancestors, by the way. "So if the young braves have pushed the white men, I have done this myself. So I want you to let Governor Ramsey know this. I have a great many prisoners, women and children. I want you to give me an answer to the bearer." Now, General Sibley got that letter, and this was his reply. "Little Crow, you have murdered many of our people without any sufficient cause. Return me the prisoners under a flag of truce, and I will talk with you then like a man." You can see the chess game being played here. So Little Crow had no intention of returning the prisoners before the long trader gave some indication of whether he meant to carry out Governor Ramsey's dictum of extermination or exile for the Santee. And he wanted to use the prisoners for bargaining. In the councils of the various bands, however, there was much disagreement over what course the Santee should take before Sibley's army reached the Yellow Medicine. So Paul Mazacutamane of the Upper Agency Sissetons condemned Little Crow for starting the war. "Give me all these white captives," he demanded. "I'll deliver them up to their friends. Stop fighting. No one who fights with the white people ever becomes rich or remains 2 days in one place, but is always fleeing and starving." That was his words to Little Crow. So Wabasha, who'd been in the battles at Fort Ridgely and New Ulm, was also in favor of opening up a road to peace by freeing the prisoners. But his son-in-law, Rada'in Yanka, spoke for Little Crow and the majority of the warriors. He said, quote, "I am for continuing the war, and am opposed to delivery of the prisoners. I have no confidence that the whites will stand by any agreement if they make if we give them up. Ever since we traded with them, their agents and traders have robbed and cheated us. Some of our people have been shot, some hung, others placed upon floating ice and drowned, and many have been starved in their prisons. It was not the intention of the nation to kill any of the whites until after the 4 men returned from Acton and told what they had done. When they did this, all the young men became excited and commenced the massacre. The older ones would have prevented it if they could, but since the treaties, they have lost all their influence. We may regret what has happened, but the matter has gone too far to be remedied. We have got to die. Let us, then, kill as many of the whites as possible, and let the prisoners die with us." That was the words of Wabasha. His son-in-law, Rada'in Yanka. And so on September 12th, Little Crow gave the long trader, Sibley, one last chance to end the war without further bloodshed. And in his message, he assured Sibley that the prisoners were being treated kindly. "I want to know from you as a friend," he added, "what way I can make peace for my people." Unknown to Little Crow, on that same day, Wabasha sent Sibley a secret message, blaming Little Crow for starting the war and claiming that he, Wabasha, was a friend of the good white people. He did not mention that he had fought with them a few weeks earlier at Fort Ridgely and New Ulm. "I've been kept back by threats that I should be killed if I did anything to help whites," he declared to Sibley. "But if you will now appoint some place for me to meet you, myself and the few friends that I have will get all the prisoners we can, and with our family go to whatever place you will appoint for us to meet." He wanted out of this war and this bloodshed so badly. He didn't want to die. He wanted to end this thing, even though it meant returning to a reservation and having to go through the same things all over again. So Sibley answered both of these messages immediately. He scolded Little Crow for not giving up the prisoners, telling him that this was not the way to make peace. But he didn't answer the war leader's plea for a way to end the fighting. Instead, Sibley wrote a long letter to Little Crow's betrayer, Wabasha, giving him explicit instructions for using a truce flag for delivery of the prisoners. "I shall be glad to receive all true friends of the whites," Sibley promised, "with as many prisoners as they can bring. I'm powerful enough to crush all who attempt to oppose my march, and to punish those who have washed their hands in innocent blood." This is the letter he writes to Wabasha, the man who's betraying Little Crow. So after Little Crow received the long trader Sibley's cold reply to his entreaty, he knew there was no hope for peace except abject surrender. If the soldiers could not be beaten, then it was either death or exile for the Santee Sioux. And so on September 22nd, scouts reported that Sibley's soldiers had gone into camp at Wood Lake. Little Crow decided to give them battle before they reached the Yellow Medicine. "All our fighting chiefs were present and all our best fighting Indians," Big Eagle said. "We felt that this would be the deciding fight of the war." And so again, as they'd done at Birch Coulee, the Santee silently prepared an ambush for the soldiers. And we could hear them laughing and singing when all our preparations were made. Little Crow and I and some other chiefs went to the mound or hill or to the west so as to watch the fight better when it should commence. The morning came, and an accident spoiled our plans. For some reason, Sibley did not move early as we expected he would. Our men were lying hidden, waiting patiently. Some were very near the camp lines in the ravine, but the whites did not see a man of all our men. I do not think they would have discovered our ambuscade. And it seemed a considerable time after sunup when some 4 or 5 wagons with a number of soldiers started out from the camp in the direction of the old Yellow Medicine Agency. And we learned afterward that they were going without orders to dig potatoes over at the agency 5 miles away. They came on over the prairie, right where our part of our line was. Some of the wagons were not in the road, and they had kept straight on. They would have driven right over our men as they lay in the grass. And at last they came so close that our men had to rise up and fire. And this brought on the fight, of course, but not according to the way we'd planned it. Little Crow saw it and felt very badly. The Indians that were in the fight did well, but hundreds of our men did not get into it and did not fire a shot. They were too far out. And the men in the ravine and the line connecting them with those on the road did the most of the fighting. Those of us on the hill did our best, but we were soon driven off. Mankato was killed here, and we lost a very good and very brave war chief. He was killed by a cannonball that was so nearly spent that he was not afraid of it, and it struck him in the back as he lay on the ground and killed him. The whites drove our men out of the ravine by a charge that ended the battle. We retreated in some disorder, though the whites did not offer to pursue us. We crossed a wide prairie, but their horsemen did not follow us. We lost 14 or 15 men, killed and quite a number wounded. Some of the wounded died afterward, but I do not know how many. We carried off no dead bodies, but took away all our wounded. The whites scalped all our dead men, so I have heard. By the way, after the soldiers had mutilated the dead Santee, Sibley issued an order forbidding such action by saying, "The bodies of the dead, even of a savage enemy, shall not be subjected to indignities by civilized and Christian men." This is what Sibley ordered his men. Do not take scalps. Now that evening in the Santee's camp, 12 miles above the Yellow Medicine, the chiefs held a last council. Most of them were now convinced that the Long Trader was too strong for them. The Woodland Sioux must surrender or flee to join their cousins, the Prairie Sioux of the Dakota country. Those who had taken no part in the fighting decided to stay and surrender, certain that the delivery of the white prisoners would win them friendship of Long Trader Sibley forever. They were joined by the Wabasha, who persuaded his son-in-law Rada Inyanka to stay. At the last minute, Big Eagle also decided to stay. Some of the half-breeds assured him that if he surrendered, he would only be held as a prisoner of war for a short time. He would live to regret this decision. The next morning, bitter with defeat and feeling the weight of his 60 years, Little Crow made a last speech to his followers. "I am ashamed to call myself a Sioux," he said. 700 of our best warriors were whipped yesterday by the whites. Now we had better all run away and scatter out over the plains like buffalo and wolves. To be sure, the whites had wagon guns and better arms than we, and there were many more of them, but that's no reason why we should not have whipped them, for we are brave Sioux and whites are cowardly women. I cannot account for the disgraceful defeat. It must be the work of traitors in our midst." He and Shakopee and Medicine Bottle then ordered their people to dismantle their teepees. In a few wagons taken from the agency, they loaded their goods and provisions, their women and children, and started westward. The moon of the wild rice, this is September, was coming to an end, and the cold moons were near at hand. We're pushing October here now. On September 26th, with the assistance of Wabasha and Paul Mazakutamani, and by the way, Minnesota, you start hitting October 1st, you can have a glorious autumn, or by middle of October it can turn blizzardy and cold. All depends on the year. So, Paul Mazakutamane, who displayed truce flags, Sibley marched into the Santee camp and demanded immediate delivery of the captives. 107 whites and 162 half-breeds were released to the soldiers. In a council which followed, Sibley announced that the Santee should consider themselves prisoners of war until he could discover and hang the guilty ones among them. The peace leaders protested with obsequious avowals of friendship, such as Paul Mazakutamani's, "I have grown up like a child of yours. With what is yours, you have caused me to grow, and now I take your hand as a child takes the hand of his father. I have regarded all white people as my friends, and from them I understand this blessing has come." Sibley replied by simply putting a cordon of artillery around the camp. He then sent out half-breed messengers to warn all Santee in the Minnesota Valley to come into Camp Release, as he had named the place. Those who refused to come in voluntarily would be hunted down and captured or killed. While the Santee were being rounded up and disarmed, the soldiers cut down trees. They constructed a huge log building, and its purpose was soon made clear. When most of the male Santee, about 600 of the camp's 2,000 Indians, were chained together in pairs and imprisoned there. Meanwhile, Sibley had chosen 5 of his officers to form a military court to try all Santee suspected of engaging in the uprising. As the Indians had no legal rights, he saw no reason to appoint any defense counsel for them. So the first suspect brought before the court was a mulatto named Godfrey, who was married to a woman of Wabashaw's band and had been living at the lower agency for 4 years. Now, witnesses were 3 white women who'd been among the captives. None accused him of rape, none had seen him commit a murder, but they said they had heard Godfrey boast of killing several white people at New Ulm. And on this evidence, the military court found Godfrey guilty of murder and sentenced him to be hanged. When Godfrey learned later that the court would be willing to commute his death sentence if he would identify Santee guilty of participating in the attacks, he became a willing informant. And the trials proceeded smoothly, as many as 40 Indians a day being sentenced to imprisonment or death. On November 5th, the trials ended. 303 Santee had been sentenced to death, 16 to long prison terms. The responsibility for extinguishing so many human lives, even if they were devils in human shape, quote-unquote, was more than Long Trader Sibley wanted to bear alone. He didn't want that burden on his head. He shifted the burden to the commander of the Military Department of the Northwest, General John Pope. General Pope, in turn, passed the final decision to the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. He said, "The Sioux prisoners will be executed unless the President forbids it." That's what General Pope informed Governor Ramsey, which I am sure he will not do. Now, once again, as I mentioned yesterday, if you remember Rocky and I having gone to Fort Snelling, there was a concentration camp there, down on the river flats below the fort, where they held almost 1,700, and the numbers vary, Native American, men, women, and children. And they took men from that camp, brought them down to Mankato, Minnesota, and executed them. And you can find, for the sake of my radio audience, I know I'm jumping ahead just a little bit, for the sake of the chat room audience. I want to show you the kinds of engravings that were done at this time. This is it right here. This is one of the plates that was made, I guess you could say. Let me save this. This shows the men that they executed as a result of what's going on in the narrative that I'm giving you right now. And let's see. Maybe it's a little premature in the story to show you this, but I'm going to show you anyway. And because this is what we're talking about. This takes a little doing, sorry, on the radio side, the audio side, but I'm going to throw this up there so you can see it. And for those of you who are only listening to the audio, hang in there with me. I'm trying to see where it went. Alright, hang on. Let me do this. Cancel that. Go over here. Sorry about this, folks, but I do want you to see this. I'm going to open up this image. And this is the... well, I'm having a slow time of it. I know this is riveting radio, but just hang on. Here we go. I'm going to take a screenshot of this. That'll be the best way to do this. So they've got 303 men that they want executed. And this goes all the way to Abraham Lincoln. And they say they're going to execute him unless they hear differently from Lincoln. And now they're expecting that Lincoln isn't going to say anything differently. Now, by the way, this right here, if you're watching the video simulcast, this is down in Mankato, and this is the execution. You can see the flagpole in almost the center, the troops surrounding the gallows, and you can see the Native American men that are being executed here. All that because I wanted you to take a look at this. This is a painting or a drawing that was done at the time. They used to sell this on plates. Now, I think you can still get them, like collector's plates, collector's lithographs, things like that. You can buy with this imagery on it. All right? So I'm going to have you look at that for a minute as I continue on here. So nobody wanted to bear the responsibility of killing all these men, so they sent it to the president. So being a man of conscience, Abraham Lincoln, when he got this request to kill 303 of these warriors, he asked for the full and complete record of the convictions. Lincoln asked for. If the record does not fully indicate the more guilty and influential of the culprits, please have a careful statement made on these points and forward them to me. And so on receipt of the trial records, the president assigned 2 lawyers to examine them, so as to differentiate between murderers and those who had engaged only in battle. So Lincoln's refusal to authorize immediate hangings of the 303 condemned Santees angered General Pope and Governor Ramsey. They were pissed off. I'm going to take that image down here for now. We'll get back to this. Let's see, what did I call it and where is it? Mankato, I called it. Where'd that go? So while I fumble through my controls, it's just the way it goes. Sorry. So you've got Abraham Lincoln now saying, I'm not just going to sign a writ of execution. He says, you prove your case. And so they were pissed off. Pope protested that the criminals condemned ought in every view, to be considered at once worthy of execution without exception. Now, humanity requires an immediately disposition of the case. Ramsey demanded authority from the president in order to speedy executions of the 303 condemned men. And he warned that the people of Minnesota would take private revenge on prisoners if Lincoln did not act quickly. So while President Lincoln was reviewing the trial records, Sibley moved the condemned Indians to a prison camp at South Bend on the Minnesota River. And while they were being escorted past New Ulm, a mob of citizens that included many women attempted private revenge on the prisoners with pitchforks, scalding water, and hurled stones. 15 prisoners were injured, one with a broken jaw, before the soldiers could march them beyond the town. And again on the night of December 4th, a mob of citizens stormed the prison camp, intent upon lynching the Indians. The soldiers kept the mob at bay, and the next day transferred the Indians to a stockade that was much stronger near the town of Mankato. In the meantime, Sibley decided to keep the remaining 1,700 Santee, mostly women and children, as prisoners, although they were accused of no crime other than having been born Indians. And he ordered them transferred overland to Fort Snelling, and along the way they too were assaulted by angry white citizens. Many were stoned and clubbed. A child was snatched from its mother's arms and beaten to death. At Fort Snelling, the 4-mile-long procession was shunted into a fenced enclosure on damp bottomland down below the fort, the concentration camp, where Rocky and Rainey and Sarah and I had visited just a few weeks ago, after having been there in the fall as well. And there, under soldier guard, housed in dilapidated shelters and fed on scanty rations, the remnants of the once proud Woodland Sioux awaited their fate. And on December 6th, President Lincoln notified Sibley that he should cause to be executed 39 of the 303 convicted Santee. The other condemned prisoners you will hold subject to further orders, taking care that they neither escape nor are subjected to any lawful violence. And we're at the absolute end of our time. Here again, That's the 39 Native Americans that are being executed at Mankato on the orders of Abraham Lincoln. But he spared the rest of the 303. And tomorrow, we'll hit this again. We'll give you the conclusion of Little Crow's war. Have a good night.